Welcome to the 8th Annual Seattle Area.
The Seattle Epidemiologic Research and Information Center, in collaboration with the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA Employee Education System, and the University of Washington Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, presents the 8th Annual Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Clinical Research Methods Summer Session.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the 8th Annual Seattle ERIC Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Clinical Research Methods Summer Session. My name is Ed Boyko. I'm the course director. The course today is entitled Epidemiologic Aspects of Military Post-Deployment Health Conditions, Natural Disasters, and Terrorism. I'm pleased to introduce to you today today's speaker, Dr. Dean Kilpatrick, who is a distinguished university professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and director of the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center at the Medical University of South Carolina. He and his colleagues have conducted epidemiologic studies of numerous disasters, including Hurricanes Andrew and Hugo, the 2004 hurricanes in Florida, the Pan Am 103 terrorist bombing, and the 2001 terrorist attacks in the World Trade Center in New York. Today he will be speaking about epidemiologic aspects of natural disasters. Dr. Kilpatrick.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I need to make a couple of confessions up front. One, my friends and colleagues tell me that my motto is anything worth doing is worth overdoing. And so I'm probably going to try to pack too much information into too short a period of time. I have too many slides, but I'll confess I'm trying to recover and get over that, but I'm not quite there yet. The second thing that I need to confess is that I'm actually a clinical psychologist by training, and it's sort of odd for clinical psychologists to be doing epidemiological work. And so another confessional that I have about that is that the reason that I started doing epidemiological work is I was originally working with rape victims and trying to understand rape victims and doing research with rape victims. And yet, you know that a lot of rape victims do not report the crime to police and they don't come forward for services. And so it got to bothering me a good bit about why or how one could go about trying to find out about people who do not come forward and necessarily seek treatment or services. And epidemiology seemed to be a way to go to do that. And then, as I will discuss later, I became very interested in natural disasters when one happened in my backyard, which was Hurricane Hugo. And basically my house got blown down. And so it seemed to me that natural disasters were something that went from who cares about natural disasters to these are very, very important things and we need to know about them. But anyway, before I actually get into the talk itself, I really want to acknowledge the fact that some of the work that I'm going to be talking about and some of the conceptualizations and whatnot were influenced by my colleagues, and so I won't read all their names. You can read them, but we've had a large group at the Medical University of South Carolina, as well as my colleague Sandro Galea, who used to be at the New York Academy of Medicine and is now at the University of Michigan. And actually, I'm going to be talking about survey research, and some of my colleagues at Schulman, Ronca, Bucavalis, Inc., or SRBI, it's a survey research firm, and they have contributed a lot to this work as well. And finally, we have ventured into the strange world of combining survey research with genetics, which I'll be talking about a little bit too. And so I'd like to acknowledge colleagues at Yale University and the VA Medical Center in New Haven, with also a colleague at Harvard University who's been involved as well. So actually, I guess what I should say is that Any of the things that you like that I say are obviously mine. Things that you disagree with are all of these colleagues that I'm talking about now. Actually, also this is beginning to sound a little like the Oscars, an overlong Oscar speech, but the research that I'm going to be talking about could not really have been done without funding from the National Institute of Mental Health, also the National Institute of Nursing Research, and also the Office for Victims of Crime. So obviously we're very grateful for that support. In terms of outline for my part of the course, I want to spend some time talking about definitions of what disasters are. I'd also like to discuss why using an epidemiological population-based approach is important in understanding disasters and terrorism. I want to talk some about the aspects of disasters that are likely or most likely to produce mental health impact of various sorts. A little bit about theory, because I think having some theoretical framework to guide you as you begin to try to understand disasters and their impact is important. Talk some about the consequences of disaster with particular focus on some of the mental health effects. And since I'm going to be talking about some of the telephone-based research, I really wanted to go into some depth talking about telephone-based methods and how to use those in disaster and terrorism research. And to illustrate that with quite a bit of data from some of the studies that my colleagues and I have done. I want to talk some about the impact of media on disasters, because that's kind of a controversial topic and it may be very relevant as new disasters happen, and to try to understand how the media can affect things for good or ill. Also want to talk about a disaster research and educational mentoring center, just a little bit about that that has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. It's designed to provide some just-in-time information to those that might be interested in doing some disaster research themselves at a point in time after a disaster happens. And then I have a few concluding thoughts. All this in I guess 4 sessions. So you can see why I say my motto is worth anything worth doing is worth overdoing. Let's start with defining disasters, and I really want to go through several different definitions here. One is a dictionary definition. One is some other definitions that researchers have come up with. I want to talk some about different types of disasters, and then something about characteristics of disasters that influence the impact of disasters. This is the Webster's definition of a disaster, and it is an occurrence causing widespread destruction and distress, a catastrophe. Okay? Now, there's some implications of that definition. I mean, one of which is that the impact of disasters are broad. And so that really distinguishes disasters from isolated events that happen to individuals or only a few people. So in other words, in the traumatic stress literature, of which I think disaster literature is a subset, what you find is you find some folks who focus on individual aspects of, or individual types of potentially traumatic events, such as abuse, child abuse or neglect, violent crime, other kinds of situations like that, car wrecks, various things like that. And then other people focus on broader things that happen to a lot of people at one time, or pretty much at one time. And so that's just one distinction. And so another aspect, in addition to the distinction between things that happen to individual people one at a time, or just a few at a time, and disasters which happen to many people at a time. Another aspect of that definition is that the impact can be very widespread. It can cause destruction, it can cause death, distress, or all of the above. Now, some other definitions, and by the way, people love to define things, and so there's probably 100 different definitions of disasters that I could have shared with you. You're in luck. I decided not to do that and just to focus on one or two. But one of the problems in terms of having some unified disaster research literature is that various disciplines define things in different ways. So that, for example, if you're talking about physical scientists, they will often define disasters or study disasters in terms of their physical dimensions, meaning like, well, how hard did the wind blow, you know, how, in terms of Richter scales and things like that, how much did the earth move? I mean, what are the factors associated with having all the houses blown down versus only a few? So they tend to focus on the physical dimensions. As you might imagine, social scientists look at things in different ways. And psychologists, for the most part, focus on sort of mental health or sort of psychosocial impacts. Now, the clinical psychologists focus on mental health stuff. Social psychologists will often focus on some of the social disruption and things like that happen. Sociologists look at things in terms of organizational and community impacts. And then there are economists who study disasters who actually look at direct and indirect, both financial and other sort of losses to the economy. It's interesting, I just ran across something about the tsunamis that the World Bank did recently. If you look up on the website, and they have a lot of information there, not only some about mental health things, but they have a lot of things about what happened when the tsunami hit and what it did to the economies in those regions. So as you might imagine, the literature gets to be a little like a Tower of Babel to some degree, because people are approaching it from their different perspectives, and so therefore there's not the coherence that one might like to have. A definition that I'm probably going to focus on a lot here, and this is from an in-press book that Sandy McFarlane and Fran Norris have, and they define a disaster as a potentially traumatic event, and the potential is important there as a part of that is collectively experienced, that has an acute onset, that is time delimited, and that disasters may be attributed to natural, technological, or human causes. Now you can quibble with various aspects of that. In some cases, the time-limited nature of disasters may be less clear than others, because you may have a situation where maybe there's radiation, or maybe there might have been radiation, or there might have been some toxic contamination, and people are not really sure what got exposed, who got exposed versus not, and what the health effects are. So in some cases you have to expand some of the aspects of these definitions. In terms of classification systems for disasters, there are various ones of those too, and so I'm not suggesting that this should be written on stone tablets or anything, but it's just one way of looking at it that may be useful. Natural disasters is one class, which includes things like hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis. I would add probably volcanic eruptions. There's tornadoes. I mean, there's a host of things that are considered to be natural. Floods, I guess I did mention that. It seems that we may be having some floods in certain parts of the country now, even as we speak. In terms of technological disasters, there are things like plane crashes, explosions, structural collapses when buildings fall down, collisions, train wrecks, a variety of things along that line. Then another class are what are called intentional human-made disasters. And these require some malice aforethought on the part of people. And it would include things like the Oklahoma City bombings, the September 11th terrorist attacks in New York and in Washington and Pennsylvania, the Madrid train bombing in March of 2003, the anthrax attacks in the U.S. that happened shortly after 9/11. So these would all be examples of human-made, by intentional, with malice aforethought, disasters. And then there are non-intentional things that still have some degree of human involvement. For example, the nuclear, well, not quite nuclear meltdown, but almost nuclear meltdown in 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, the actual nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl, and the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska. So these are things that have, some degree of, there were human causes to these, either through omission or commission, but basically they were not intentional in nature. Now, any kind of classification system like this breaks down if you push it very far, and there are also clearly some aspects of disasters that involve many components of these. I'm thinking of one that happened last year that might have had some natural components as well as some human-made components. Can anybody else think of that? Would anybody like to put a name to it? Katrina. So that, for example, I mean, that had several things. I mean, it was a Category 4 hurricane, which is very bad in and of its own self. But then you have levee failures, which have been demonstrated, or at least there have been some reports out now that suggest that the Corps of Engineers did not do exactly as good a job as it might have in terms of building the levees to withstand the forces they were supposed to withstand. And then you have perhaps perhaps I'm being kind here, but I would say governmental failure at every level possible, not to put too fine a point on it, afterwards, which complicated what would have been a huge natural disaster in and of its own self. So, in other words, these things are not, as I say, written on stone tablets, and sometimes you have to use your common sense in terms of how you would classify a given type of disaster. Now, it may be worthwhile saying, well, why do we care about disasters, and why do we care about understanding disasters and what their impact is? And so let me just run through a few reasons why that might be important. First of all, these are prevalent events. So they are a major problem in the U.S. and throughout the world. If you look internationally particularly, the death toll is very large, and property damage and negative economic impact is substantial. So in other words, one reason we should care about it is because it destroys a lot of stuff, kills a lot of people, causes other types of problems, and costs a lot of money. So those are the types of things that we usually care about, and so we should care about these. This is a somewhat dated report, and frankly, if we did it again, it would be much higher. But worldwide, it's been estimated that disasters produce an average of about 50,000 deaths a year, half again as many injuries, and then that each year about 5 million people are displaced from homes. Now, if you looked at the last 4 or 5 years, or since this report in 1999, I think those numbers would be much higher. I mean, and again, one of the things people talk about a little bit in terms of the global warming, I mean, there's some questions about that, but people seem to suggest that there may be some increase in certain types of natural disasters around those. Let me just run through a few natural disasters that have happened, or major disasters that have happened recently. Just in May of this year, there was a major earthquake in Indonesia that Indonesia seems to be getting more than its fair share of things lately, but it's killed a lot of people, destroyed, caused a lot of property damage, displaced a lot of people, on top of some of the tsunami problems that happened before. Last year, there was an earthquake, a major earthquake near the Pakistan-India border, which killed, I don't have an exact death toll, but killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people. destroyed an awful lot of property, and people are still not back after that. They were not back to normal after that. There were hurricanes Katrina and Rita, along with about 25 others, it seems like. When they have to run through the whole alphabet, and then they run through the whole Greek alphabet, and then they have to start over, and there's one in December, or rather one in January, I think. It's a lot of hurricanes. But particularly Rita and Katrina caused enormous amounts of damage. There was also a terrorist bombing in London. Then in 2004, you had the major tsunami in Southeast Asia. And if anybody wants to get some detailed statistics on that, the World Bank's website actually has country by country a lot of information about the death toll, as well as the economic damages, as well as the property damage that was there, as well as to some degree how people are recovering from that. Then we had 4 hurricanes in Florida. I'll be talking about those a bit later. Florida had 4 major hurricanes hit it within a 2 or 3 month period. Then there was also the terrorist train bombing in Madrid. I didn't put 2003. I'm sure there was major things going on someplace. But in 2002, there was a major volcanic eruption or series of those in Martinique, the island of Martinique, that killed a lot of people and caused a lot of property damage. And then, of course, in 2001, we had the September 11th terrorist attacks. So again, it appears that these are things that we're all going to have to deal with. And I'll just sort of let you know, too, that I know you're from all over, but there are only, I think it's 1 or 2 states in the United States that is not prone to any type of natural disasters. And I'm not going to tell you what those states are, but they're probably not the states that you're from. And I've just saw something on the History Channel not long ago about sort of nightmare scenarios in terms of disasters. And where we are right now, you got your earthquakes, you got your tsunami potential, you have basically that beautiful mountain there, which turns out to be a volcano that everybody says is going to blow up someday, and it will be a very bad thing. So, in other words, I think we all have to say that if we have not yet been a disaster victim, you may be one in the future, or your community may be. So that's why wherever you are, people will be looking to you, probably, as people who ought to know something about how to address these issues. And it's kind of a scary thought, because I know from personal experience, when the hurricane happened in Charleston, South Carolina, people kept looking at us and saying, well, you're traumatic stress people, you need to know how to deal with this. And you know what? We didn't have a clue. And so my goal really is to get you to the point where when they look at you, you will at least have a little clue, and you'll remember that there was something, and you'll go look stuff up really quickly, and then that way you can be an expert in your community. Another reason why we should focus on disasters and understanding them is that there's a lot of literature, a good bit of which I'm going to go through with you, to show that disasters have a negative impact on physical health, they have a negative impact on mental health, and they have an impact on the economic well-being of communities that suffer, at least in the short run. Now, some of the communities do better in the long run, but at least in the short run, there's some real problems there. And then also, another reason why we need to understand these is that policymakers and practitioners need good data for planning and to guide what to do in a disaster. Again, people at governmental levels, as well as institutions and all these kind of folks, they may be in a position where they've got to make decisions after disaster or even before a disaster, like what should we do here? Where should we put our resources? How should we get ready? How should we meet the needs? And again, contrary to what many people believe, I don't think that policymakers and decision makers have a vested interest in making dumb decisions just for the sake of making dumb decisions. Now, that's a debatable fact, and maybe at happy hour we can sort of have a little conversation about that. But I think that really people try to do the best they can based on the information they have. And so that one of the, this may be an aspirational goal on my part, but you kind of think that maybe if you could get people better information, well, then maybe they could make better decisions. I'm very old to be so idealistic, but I can't help it. All right. Yes?
One type of disaster I noticed you did not include are biological disasters. In particular, I'm thinking of, on one hand, the 1918 flu that was worldwide, case mortality rate of 2%, and overwhelmed the many public health systems. And then the foreshadowing with H5N1 coming down the pike, and the issue of not if, but when. Now, granted that a lot of your definition included a certain spatial delimitation, and that would violate the spatial piece. However, the flu pandemics are delimited in time. Thoughts?
I think you're exactly right, and I did mention it. I will be talking a little bit more about some, sort of bioterrorism types of things later. But no, I think flu pandemics would certainly fit it, or any kind of infectious disease on a scale like that would certainly fit that, because it's not something that just happens to individuals. It has a major public health component, and managing sort of terror reactions on the part of people will be a key component. So again, I don't know that there have been many studies of that. I mean, obviously in 1918, the research base for social scientists was underdeveloped, let us say. But when you have a lot of people dying and a lot of people worried about contagion and knowing how to manage that, and fears about, I mean, you get the cold when something like that's, get a cold when something like that's happened, I think you would be pretty upset. So again, I would certainly include the things that you mentioned in my definition of disasters as well. So thank you for raising that point. Let me just try to make a little argument for why maybe looking at a population-based epidemiological perspective would be important. First, because of their broad scope, destructive magnitude, high visibility, there are some disasters that affect entire communities. And again, the pandemic flu issue that you raised, it may be that the community is the world, really. I mean, it's like something that could be worldwide in nature. So it affects the entire communities and not just a few individuals. For these types of disasters, it is impossible to determine the impact by simply identifying the few individuals who've been affected and then studying them. So instead, we must look at and sample a population-wide group in order to determine the impact on the entire community. And let me just illustrate that by saying, let's suppose you're trying to do a study of Katrina in the Gulf of Mexico, last year. That's a picture of Katrina, and I'm sure you saw that a lot on the Weather Channel. You probably didn't see it as many times as we did in South Carolina, because we watched the Weather Channel. And let me just ask you this. How many of you here know what time the tropical update comes on the Weather Channel? Raise your hands if you know it. Okay. The answer is 50 minutes after the hour. And everybody, 90% of the people in South Carolina during hurricane season and in the Gulf regions and everywhere else knows when the tropical update is. But at any rate, so there's a pretty big storm out in the Gulf. This is just a list of the counties in Louisiana that were declared disaster areas right after the storm hit. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Louisiana geography, but you know what? That's a lot of counties. It really is. But it gets worse. These are the Mississippi counties that were declared disaster areas. Now, my point here is that if you were trying to study the effects of that disaster, there would not be a list anywhere of like 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 or 100, couple of hundred people who were affected by those disasters. If you were trying to find the impact of those on the communities that it hit, what you would have to do is that you would have to somehow locate and sample people from those entire communities if you wanted to know what the entire impact was. Now, there are various ways that one can do studies, and what I'm going to argue a little bit is that there are some real advantages to using probability samples and epidemiological methods, and that some of those advantages are, for one, it provides you with valuable information about mental health burden and help seeking for the entire population. Again, if you wanted to know, like, what are the mental health effects of something, what would be the problem with just going into the various sort of clinics that have been set up and seeing how many people came forward to ask for help? This is not a trick question. It requires an audience response.
Not everyone can get to the clinics.
That's right. Not everybody can get to the clinics. Now, do you think that everybody who has problems would try to get to the clinics?
No, there's a certain number of people that would be either overwhelmed and couldn't get as far as thinking about seeking help, or who would deny that they needed help.
Right. As they say, denial is not just a river in Egypt, that sometimes people who have, I should have also confessed to have bad jokes during this, but attempted humor will happen occasionally during these. It's the only way I can justify giving you as many slides as I have, is at least I try to keep it a little light here. In other words, that the number of people who can come forward, who will come forward and all that is not one-to-one with the people who actually have problems, who need some sort of treatment, so that basically you can look at the entire population, you get a better judge of how the entire population's been affected, because it would include people who've been affected not very much, a little bit, a lot. It also, because of a design that you use there, can give you some information about risk and protective factors associated with disaster-related mental health problems, as well as resilience. And let me just say that that resilience is something which we don't pay enough attention to, and which is understudied in a way, but it's important. And so it's not only important to find out who is doing poorly after a disaster, it's also important to find out who is doing well, and if so, well, what are the differences between those? What are the risk and protective factors? If you use a population-based epidemiological design, that gives you the possibility of looking at some of those important issues. Now, if we study the effects of disaster within an entire population as opposed to just a few people who've been affected the worst, what you would expect is to first see a broad range of psychological reactions, ranging from mild distress in some people to persistent mental disorders in others. And secondly, you would expect, just a priori, that more people would have mild distress than who would develop persistent mental health disorders. And this is illustrated, and this is, by the way, not necessarily a database thing, but it's sort of a heuristic model, and it's sort of an inverse-shaped pyramid. And so what you see is that if you look at the number over to the right and to the greater number would have mild distress, then you would have a slightly less large number that would have a short-term stress reaction. Then you would have maybe some people developing short-term mental disorders. And then down at the bottom, you would have some people with persistent mental disorders. Now, I have to say that for the most part, the way we talk about our delivery system after some sort of disaster, what we try to gear up for is largely the people down at the bottom of that pyramid, for whom there would be the fewest number. And what we do the least for is for the broadest number of people in the population. So that, for example, you get mental health counselors who swoop in any place after some sort of disaster approaches, with the notion that they're going to do one-to-one or sort of group interventions with a whole bunch of people. And then what you don't really see is people trying to address the fact that, okay, most people are going to be resilient. And so, and it's sort of normal when your house gets blown down, when you've been in a flood for 3 or 4 days, you don't have anything to eat, you're worried about being rescued, you don't know where the rest of your family is. It's pretty normal to be distressed in that kind of situation. And if you're not, then we've got to really worry about you a little bit. I mean, if you're not at least somewhat distressed by that, well, then you're either superhuman or you just don't understand the situation, okay? But to be able to say to people that, okay, that's a normal type of thing, but, I've got some good news for you, which is most people do not develop persistent mental health problems as a function of these disasters. So anyway, it's a way to think about looking at the whole population and maybe how some of the problems are distributed within the population if you look at it from an epidemiological, easy for me to say, let me take the marbles out and try again. From an epidemiological perspective, looking at an entire population-based approach. Now, I'm going to sort of do this backwards a little bit and try to summarize what the literature tells us a little bit about some of the things that seem to increase negative impact on mental health of disasters. So, if you look at the death toll, that will give you, that's one indicator of how bad a disaster is, obviously. Unfortunately, in the United States and most other developed nations, the death toll from natural disasters, or even terrorist attacks for that matter, tend to be on the low side compared to some developing nations and underdeveloped nations. There are a variety of reasons for that. For example, if you take earthquakes and you have a same magnitude earthquake in San Francisco versus one in Pakistan, the odds are you will have a bigger death, or Turkey or some of the other countries like that, if you don't have building codes that are, if you have masonry buildings and things like that, they're going to fall down and they're going to kill people. Whereas if you have modern building codes, you will have less people who are killed. The extent of property damage. I mean, some of this is not exactly rocket science here. I mean, some of these are rounding up the usual suspects in terms of kinds of ways of looking at disasters. But if you have a lot of extensive property damage, then generally that's going to be associated with a higher mental health impact. If you have basically the duration of disaster exposure. Now, one reason some people have said that that Katrina's effects were worse in New Orleans, maybe than they were on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, is because basically the duration of that went on. And to some degree, it's still going on for some people. But I mean, with the flooding, which did not go away, in Mississippi, which actually got worse wind damage, but the day after, or the next day, you could go in and you could start rebuilding your life. You could start looking for your stuff, which many people couldn't find. You could start, getting on with yourself. But in New Orleans, with the floods, people couldn't even get back home, in some cases for months, and so they're sort of in a limbo, so you have a much more broad duration there. If there is potential exposure to toxic agents, and I emphasize the potential, which may be actual or maybe you just think you might have been, that seems to be worse. For example, there's some studies that are coming out now. In fact, I read one in the Journal of USA Today on the plane, my plane trip before coming here. But it was about that there's a study out now in New York about some of the people who are working on the site of 9/11 who are having these sort of unexplained medical symptoms and respiratory problems and all of that. And there's a big debate back and forth about how much people, EPA saying, don't worry, we took care of you, everything's just fine. Strangely enough, some people don't believe that, and so there's a question of how much exposure people had to various, toxins there, and that has certainly aggravated that situation. Extent of media coverage is another thing which can aggravate things. If it's a disaster and it doesn't get covered very much, that's one thing. But some people would say that if you have a disaster and they keep showing it over and over and over again, that it's a way of continuing the exposure to it. Doesn't just happen once. You have to see it and be reminded of it over and over again. As I say, I will be later talking about that, later in the session, talking about that in much greater detail. Again, it's also sort of a chicken and egg thing, because obviously bigger disasters tend to get more coverage than little disasters do. So in other words, one could argue that, well, what drives media coverage is how big the disaster is. And then also things that involve a lot of criminal justice system, civil litigation, or geopolitical involvement. What do I mean by that? If it's a terrorist attack that involves criminal justice system, they're arresting people, or it's a school shooting or something like that where there's a lot of criminal justice system involvement, that's a long, drawn-out process. Basically, they try people. It takes a while to do that. Then, if people are convicted or not, if they're convicted, their appeals, they go on for a long time, and so that tends to keep it going. Civil litigation, there's some argument that cases that involve people suing somebody about some action or inaction that they took, that may make a disaster worse in some ways for people. A couple of ways of looking at that, and this is my theory. I don't know that I could substantiate it with a whole lot of data, but people tend to sue for two reasons. One of which is if they get upset by the way people respond and they get blown off by authorities, they sue because they're mad at somebody because the person won't acknowledge anything, and they just say, I'm not going to respond to you and I'm going to ignore you and whatever. And the other thing is if something hurts you a lot, I mean, if some family members are killed, or you're very emotionally upset by what happened, you are more likely to go to the trouble to sue than you are if it's just had no effect on you at all. Well, those things make it very difficult to disentangle, whether it's just that people who have suffered more negative effects are in fact the ones who sue versus not. But some of the early disaster literature was based on the Buffalo Creek disaster, in which an earthen dam broke and just was very, very devastating, and it killed a lot of people and all that. But there was litigation going on in that case for a long time, and some have argued that it was the litigation that was making things worse. But as I say, you could turn around and argue, well, gee, it's hard to imagine anything much worse that happened to those people than happened in that valley, and so maybe that's why they were suing in the first place. The geopolitical involvement, and I will be talking later in this session about the Pan Am 103 bombing. And that was a case in which Libyan terrorists, it turns out, blew this plane up, and there were UN resolutions, there was a boycott of Libya, there was this huge, massive geopolitical thing that was going on around that case, and it went on for years and years and years. And so it precluded, I think, family members in some ways from getting closure. And you know what? It's still going on. The good news is we've now recognized Libya. The bad news is that what happened as a part of that is that they wrote off part of the civil judgment that actually they wound up getting in that case, that the family members got in the case. So even though it's been over, trying to remember how long it's been not 20 years, but probably between 15 and 20 years ago that happened. And it's still, the geopolitical stuff is still not over for the families in that case. Now, I think most experts would agree that if disasters involve some aspect of terrorism or mass casualty incidents, that those are worse for several reasons. One, there's more vicarious exposure to death and injury due to greater likelihood of media coverage. I mean, when you have a lot of deaths or it's terrorism, you get a lot of media coverage, and so therefore you get this vicarious exposure to what happened. Secondly, there's more of a risk that somebody in the community may actually know somebody, or they may even be a relative of somebody that was killed or seriously injured. And then if you have a whole community that gets whacked by something, it may, I mean, the good news is people try to do what they can, and it may mobilize social support. But if everybody's affected, it may impair the ability of that community to provide the type of social support that's and other types of instrumental support that's very useful to people. A little bit about silent disasters, including bioterrorism. One of the important things there is it's very difficult for people to be certain about the degree to which they've been exposed or not to whatever it is that's going on. I was mentioning earlier that in the anthrax attacks that happened after the latter part of 9/11, and there was a lot of media coverage of that. I work in a medical school, and somebody found some suspicious white powder. And so what they did with it is they brought it to our hospital's emergency room. Now, some would argue that thanks a lot, guys. I mean, now you've possibly contaminated. I mean, I think it turned out to be sweet and low or something. But the thing is, you're not certain about what it is. You're not certain about whether you've been exposed, and so there's some behavior there that goes on. Now, unlike natural disasters and mass murders where you know when it happened, it's hard to say, well, what was the beginning of this and what's the end of it? Because you really aren't sure whether people have been exposed or not, and so it's hard to know it's over with so that you can get on to your life of recovery. There's also a lot of times uncertainty about the extent and nature of health effects of exposure to toxic agents. And I'll just mention 2 or 3 things. Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. I will mention the Gulf War syndrome. I will mention also 3 Mile Island. And as far as I know, in 3 Mile Island, there was actually very little or no actual release of radiation. However, studies that Andy Baum and his colleagues did, following people up later, found that if you compared, people who were within a pretty close geographic radius to 3 Mile Island versus a control community that was further away, you had effects on catecholamines, you had increased depression, you had a whole bunch of other difficulties concentrating, a whole bunch of differences between those people that were driven largely by the perception that somebody had been exposed as opposed to actual exposure. Now, I don't know, maybe somebody now has proved that they really were exposed. But my point about this is not to really sort of litigate what caused what, but it's just to say that the placebo effect is very alive and well. That's why we have to do studies, when we're trying drugs, and we find that in most cases you will get, 30% of people are placebo responders. So the point here is that when you are looking at and trying to decide about the health effects of exposure to these things, it's hard for scientists with well-controlled studies to try to sort them out. It's very, very hard if you were a person in that community. I believe we have a question.
I'd question the notion of referring to what you just did as a placebo effect. I mean, placebo from the standpoint of that these people were not exposed to a physical toxin. But I think in many cases you could argue that they were exposed to a psychological toxin. If you go back to the DSM, it's not necessary for you to be hurt or killed. It's necessary for there to be a threat that involves potential death or potential serious harm. And so what you're describing in the TMI case are people who were exposed to a threat that was ill-defined, a threat that probably didn't exist, but still at the time, courtesy of the media and other mechanisms, the threat existed and the threat was real, even if later evidence indicated that there was no actual biological exposure.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a fair point. And being a clinical psychologist, I obviously think that perception of danger is an important thing, and maybe as important as danger itself. But the point that I was evidently unsuccessfully trying to make, about this particular issue is that when there are questions about a degree of exposure, and there are also questions about whether these types of things, the extent to which they can cause health effects, and some people think they were exposed, and some people weren't, obviously. And then you see a lot of health effects. It's clear that even the thought that one may have been exposed, and one does not know with certainty what the health effects are, that it creates a more difficult situation than when I know I got shot at. I know they missed me, I'm alive, so therefore, I at least know what my degree of exposure was. Now, even people who are shot at and missed often will develop psychological and even health problems afterwards. But I'm just saying the uncertainty about degrees of exposure as well as about health effects complicates things a lot. But I take your basic point. And then health effects of exposure to certain toxic agents may not be immediate. And so you find yourself sitting around waiting for something to develop. Now we'll mention radiation being one, that you may have a low radiation dose that basically may cause some effects that don't show up till your kids come around later. You talk about tobacco, which people can smoke 2 packs a day for 20 years and do kind of okay, sort of, but then maybe the 2 packs a day catches up with them later. Or even asbestos, in which people were exposed maybe during World War II and are coming down with problems much later. So in other words, there are concerns about these delayed effects too, that it just makes it harder to sort out, which creates the psychological uncertainty, which creates to the stress levels. This is, I think, a good definition that Bonnie Green came up with, in which she was talking about the impact ratio as a way of sort of saying, well, how bad something likely to be. And so what she said was that if a large proportion of people are affected by the disaster, the impact ratio is high. And that in general, if you look at disasters that have a high impact ratio, they will have more negative effects on everybody than those that have on a community rather than those that have a low impact ratio. So basically, this is sort of common sense on one level, but if you take all these things together and you say, well, let's add them up and let's see how many people are affected in various ways within a given community. If you have an awful lot of those, or that impact ratio is high, that is going to be a lot worse. I mean, in New Orleans would be a great example of something with a very, very high impact ratio. But at any rate, if you have a few houses that are hit by a tornado, it may affect those few individuals in that small community very much. But if that's in a city of 100,000 people, well, then maybe the whole community will be affected some, but not as much as if half the people in that community have been affected. A little about disasters caused by terrorism. By its definition, terrorists don't want to just kill people. I mean, they do want to kill people, and if they could kill a lot of people, they'd be happier. But the whole point here is to magnify and leverage the effect of what you're doing by not just affecting the people that you kill or injure, but using that to affect a much broader group of people. And so one of the ways that terrorists do this is through their skillful use of the news media. And I would argue that 9/11 was a made-for-TV, carefully thought-out moment. Happens in the morning. I don't think it was an accident that the planes hit at different times. What happened? New York is the biggest media town in the U.S. There's live TV programs going on, so they knew that the second event would be covered live, and I think it was designed to maximize the terrorist thing. The anthrax attacks, who did they send it to? Politicians in leadership roles in the Senate. And do you think that if Tom Brokaw's assistant gets an anthrax letter, that would get covered by NBC and all the other news media? So again, I think terrorists are very, very skillful in terms of using the news media. So terrorists succeed when they terrify large numbers of people and get them to restrict their lifestyles and behavior. And usually what people are after is not only to get you to change the way you live your life, it's to sort of then put pressure on people to make other types of political changes that you want to do. And the important thing here is that terrorism's effects extend far beyond those who are direct victims. And I think anybody in the U.S. who went through 9/11 and says, well, how are our lives different now? Do y'all fly much? Is that a different experience now? But I think it's important to understand that part of the reason for terrorism is just basically to try to affect as many people as you can, not just the direct victims. I think that maybe this would be a good time to conclude this session. And so what we've talked about now is some of the definitions of different disasters and types of disasters, why it's important to study disasters, and what we'll be talking about next are some theories about that try to explain the degree of psychological impact, as well as some information about telephone methods specifically.